Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up the 11 books that I read in July. So these are going to be little mini reviews of the books that I read in July. July was one of my best reading months of the whole year, both in terms of like quantity of what I was reading, but also quality of what I was reading. So without further ado, let's get into the books, and I'm gonna start with one of, if not the best book that I read, not only in July, but for the whole year, and that is The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. Now, it's no surprise that I absolutely loved this book. Caroline O'Donoghue is one of my favourite authors. I've really enjoyed her YA trilogy, but I have been absolutely obsessed with her adult books. I read Promising Young Women during the first lockdown and thought it was incredible. I also loved Scenes of a Graphic Nature, so having a new book from her, I was just so excited to read this, and it did not disappoint. This is a novel about an all-consuming love story, but it is the love story between friends. So we have Rachel and James, and we follow the journey of their whole friendship when they meet while working in a bookstore, decide to move in together, and the intensity of the friendship that develops between the two of them. We're not just looking at the friendship between these two, although they are the core of the novel and the real heart of the novel, but we're also looking at the relationships that they have with other people. And one of the most significant figures is Dr. Byrne, who is one of Rachel's professors. And we're looking at how both Rachel and James's lives become interwoven with Dr. Byrne's in really complicated, messy ways. The book is set in Ireland in the early noughties, and I think the author does an incredible job of capturing what that experience was like, what it was like to be in like your early 20s during that time, all of the kind of cultural flags of that time, but also it massively captures a lot of the anxieties that people had, particularly in relation to LGBTQ plus matters, and also the huge and contradictory pressures and like slut shaming and fear that young women were subject to at this time and continue to be subject to. One of the elements of this book that I absolutely adored was the fact that everyone exists in the grey in this book. There are no kind of morally right or wrong characters. Everyone is very much in the grey, and I think in a different novel, Dr. Byrne in particular would be painted as this very kind of villainous, immoral character. I could continue to talk about this book and gush about it so much, but I want to push this into absolutely everyone's hands. It is so sharply, so acutely crafted. I loved every single page, every single sentence of this book. In July, I also read The Intimacy Experiment by Rosie Danan. I had really high expectations for a really spicy, steamy read after I read The Roommate, also by the same author. The Roommate was kind of the book that got me into like reading spicy books. This book isn't like a straight up sequel, like you don't need to have read The Roommate to read The Intimacy Experiment. However, there are characters from that book that you would recognize in this one, and our main character, Naomi, is a character that you do meet for the first time in The Roommate, so I would recommend reading The Roommate first. So Naomi Grant is an adult performer. She is a porn star. She has co-founded this really sex positive startup that is all about educating people and improving their sex lives. This has proven to be a hugely successful business, and Naomi is ready to take the next steps in being a sex educator. She wants to take her educational platform into the real world and start educating in person rather than just online. However, no higher education institute is going to hire her. She then meets Ethan, who is a rabbi at the local synagogue, and it is his intention to bring more people into the synagogue, specifically more young people, and he thinks Naomi's perspective on modern intimacy could be something that could really drive people in, so he invites her to start a seminar series about modern intimacy. This seminar series is met with quite contrasting opinions, and some people really do not approve of Ethan's choice in educator, and it causes a lot of conflict for him at work. Naomi's also dealing with a lot of her own internal conflicts about making her peace with her past, resolving some traumas, and also healing the relationship that she has with her Judaism. Of course, there is also sizzling sexual tension between these two characters, and while they do get it on, that's not a spoiler, like we know they're going to get it on, there wasn't as much action as there was in The Roommate. So I was left like a little bit disappointed by that. Nonetheless, I did enjoy it and I would definitely read more from this author. I found the perspective on religion really interesting. I hadn't read a lot about those kind of perspectives before, and especially about kind of healing the relationship that you have with your religion. And one of my favorite aspects of this book, as with The Roommate, wasn't just the steamy scenes, but it was how positive it is about sex and also like its insight into the adult entertainment industry. I thought that was really interesting. I also read Asking for a Friend by Andy Osho, and sadly I was really disappointed in this book. So this book is meant to be about these three friends who are struggling with their dating lives for a few different reasons. And they decide to make this pact that sounds like it's going to be really fun, where instead of asking people out for themselves, they are asking people out for their friends. So like they're picking out a match for their friend and asking them out like on their friend's behalf. That sounds like a recipe for just so much fun, so much like mischief and shenanigans. Really, what this book is mostly these three friends arguing for the whole novel. I didn't really see this as a celebration of female friendship. It kind of concludes with somewhat of a reconciliation and celebration of female friendship, but I do feel like most of the book was just these women like refusing to understand each other and refusing to be empathetic towards each other. I think it was also really clear which character the author was most interested in, and maybe she should have just written a book about that character's life. I sometimes struggle with books that are also about authors. It can be something that like really bothers me in a book, especially if there's like little bits about like the publishing industry that just don't ring true to me. And also a bit of a pet hate that I have is when comedians write books and are really trying to be funny. I was familiar with this author for her work as a stand-up comedian and also on panel shows and stuff, and generally I found her funny when I've watched her on TV. But I often find that when comedians start to write fiction, that humor just doesn't really translate. It comes across as like really cheesy and try hard, and that is what I found with this book, sadly. I think this is one of those books where unfortunately the concept was greater than the execution. I also read a classic in July. I know, who is she? I read The Island of Dr Moreau by H.G. Wells. So this is the fourth book I've read from H.G. Wells, and it's definitely the one that I found kind of the most disturbing and gory and creepy. So the main character we're following in this book is a guy called Edward, and he is the sole survivor of a shipwreck. He is rescued by this vessel that has this menagerie of very strange, savage creatures. He then finds himself stranded on this island and comes to the realization that the doctor on this island has been experimenting on animals and experimenting on humans. And when he comes to this realization, he is struck with the knowledge that he could be in huge danger. And there's this sort of thriller, horror-esque atmosphere to this book as you race through it, not sure what's going to happen to Edward. I think what's really interesting about reading Victorian fiction as a whole, but specifically about the sci-fi that was being written at that time, is that it tells you so much about the kind of moral and intellectual concerns and anxieties of the time. So all of these new scientific discoveries that are being made, Darwinian theory, how all of these new discoveries are shaping what people are thinking about and also what they fear. I think it's quite fascinating to contextualize that in a modern context when a major concern that we have in 2023 is the growth of artificial intelligence and what that means in the future. And there's a lot of fear about what AI is going to become. And it's interesting to think about how in the Victorian era, there was so much concern and fear around new developing science. And I think that's sort of the response that I've had to all of the H.G. Wells books that I've read, is less kind of necessarily enjoying the story itself, but finding the historical context and the intellectual intent behind it a really interesting conversation to have. I also read Why Do You Wear a Cheap Watch by Hans Fallada. This is one of the Penguin mini modern series, which are really slim books which give you a little bit of a taster of someone's writing. And in this very slim book, we have a selection of stories that are kind of like streetwise tales of like grifters and ordinary people in pre-war Germany. If I'm being honest, I didn't really get much from this book, and I have had that experience quite a lot recently with these kind of like mini modern classics. Perhaps if I looked at all of the ones I read recently, there might be like some sort of like writing style or the fashion of the writing at the time. Maybe they were all published at a similar time. And I just don't get on with that. There may be some sort of connection. Or perhaps the just really short form is just not something that I can like really get into because I don't really have a chance to fully get into it. So yeah, not one that is a favorite. But I will be keeping hold of this book because it's like a souvenir from when I went to Berlin. I also read 2 poetry anthologies in July. So I read The Fire People and More Fire. This first one is a collection of British Black and Asian poetry, and this is a collection of Black British poetry only. Overall, I really enjoyed both of these collections. I think there was a real range of different styles of poetry included in them. Some that was more kind of lyrical, some that was more form-led, some that was definitely a bit more kind of experimental, some that was really driven by rhyme. There was a whole range of different styles of poetry across both of these collections, and that was really great. It does mean that some of it was more to my poetry taste than others. There were some poets included in this that I knew I was already a fan of, like Warsan Shire and Dean Atta, but lots of new voices for me to explore as well. I also thought some of the recurring themes that came up in these collections in relation to being Black or being Asian in Britain were really interesting and really important voices to be listening to. I think traditionally poetry has been like a really white dominated space, and some of the most exciting writers in contemporary poetry are people of color, are Black and Asian people. So big recommendation if you're a poetry fan, if you're someone that wants to try out poetry for the first time, you'll either find a bunch of new poets to enjoy or you will be able to discover kind of what type of poetry that you are into. I read a couple of non-fiction books as well, and while we're on anthologies, let's stick with it. So I read What Writers Read, which was edited by Pandora Sykes. So this very adorable, beautifully packaged book that is beautiful for gifting is made up of 35 really quite small essays from 35 different writers where they are talking about their favorite book. There were lots of writers in here that I hadn't read from before, and I think got more from the essays of those authors that I was familiar with. I'm sure if you are a reader, there will be some authors in here that you really like. I had a really cozy reading evening reading this book, which was exactly how I wanted to experience it. Like this sort of book in the beautiful package that it is, books about books. It was just the perfect like snacks, cup of tea, fairy lights on reading experience. But it's not one that really stayed with me. Like I don't find myself thinking about anything that was raised by any of these writers, to be honest, or kind of their relationships with any of the books that they discussed. The 2 essays that really stayed with me the most were maybe from Benjamin Zephaniah and Marian Keyes, but they are 2 writers that I absolutely love, so that kind of makes sense. And even though there are other writers in here that I'm definitely a big fan of, none of the other essays really left much of an impact on me. Like I don't really find myself thinking about any of them, and that is okay. It's not one that stayed with me. It was a very cozy, like enjoyable reading experience. I think maybe because a lot of the books that they were discussing were not books that I had read before. So maybe if I had read more of them, it would have stayed with me a bit more. I also read Girls Can Kiss Now by Jill Gutowitz. This is essentially a collection of essays about like pop culture and being gay. I love books about pop culture, like Taylor Swift is mentioned in this book a lot, as well as the kind of these really memorable kind of cultural moments that I think a lot of girls who were like figuring out that they were queer in like the 2010s, a lot of kind of cultural moments that if you were going through that like I was, you will be like, oh yeah, I remember that being like a moment. The whole essay collection is basically this exploration of the intersection between like pop culture and queer culture. There were a couple of issues that I had with this book just in terms of like my personal preferences with like writing style. So if you are someone that is kind of annoyed by the level of privilege that comes across when you read like Dolly Alderton or Elizabeth Day, then you might find elements of this a little bit grating. That's not to say, of course, the author has had an entirely privileged life. You know, she's definitely faced marginalization because of her sexuality, but there's a lot of other elements to her lifestyle that does just feel really like privileged at times. Also, what I mentioned earlier in relation to asking for a friend when someone who is maybe like a comedy writer is trying so hard to be funny and it feels very try hard. I also like felt that with this book. I think it's definitely worth reading. Like, I love books that are about pop culture. She gets huge props for the amount of times that she mentions Taylor Swift. Although I do find like the speculation around Taylor's sexuality like an uncomfortable conversation to have because it's none of our business. But yeah, overall, solid non-fiction read. I'm going to finish off by reviewing 2 books that I read for work. So they are books that are published by the place that I work, by the team I work for. So, you know, full disclosure on that front. The first of those was a young adult book, and it was How to Die Famous by Benjamin Dean. I know so many of you are massive fans of this author, as am I. Have loved every single one of his books, middle grade and YA, and this one is no different. We have lots of different perspectives in this book, so if you are someone that enjoys jumping around like and being in lots of people's heads, definitely recommend it for that kind of narrative style. But we are mainly kind of focused on Abel as a center point. So he is set to be Hollywood's like latest prodigy, latest like heartthrob. He has been cast in this really infamous show where there is kind of a lot of darkness around the treatment of the cast of this show and what has happened to them. And Abel has a secret. Abel is actually an undercover journalist that is investigating the kind of dark underbelly of these Hollywood shows, and he has a particularly personal connection and reason for doing that. He wants to expose the scandal and the murder that is hidden beneath all the kind of rumors and gossip around this show. I think if you are someone who read like Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, and you found its dissection of childhood celebrity really interesting and the kind of darkness in Hollywood and these shows with very young stars in them, I think if you found that conversation interesting, then you would really get on with this book. It's super page turning, really twisty. Big fan. I also read The House with the Dragon in It by Nick Lake with illustrations by Emily Gravitz. I love Emily Gravitz's illustrations. I think they're so gorgeous. This book is about Summer, and one day she is having dinner with her foster family when a massive hole opens up in the middle of their house. The hole leads Summer down to a dragon who tells her that a very unusual witch is going to grant her 3 wishes. Summer wishes for what she thinks is going to improve her life. She wishes for popularity and tons of money. But this doesn't improve her life in the way that she's anticipating. And in fact, this hole in their living room is getting bigger and bigger, and the witch is getting even more strange and sinister. This is one of those very like creepy, literary, lyrical children's stories that both feels like really dark and creepy, but also really kind of tugs on your heartstrings in a big way. Emily's illustrations really bring the text to life, and there are some particularly impressive spreads towards the end of the book, which are like just fantastic. This was another one that I had a really cozy reading experience with. So that's it. They are all of the books that I read in July. I hope you enjoyed hearing me chat through them. If you've read any of them, do leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought. If you don't have anything in particular to say, but you want to let me know that you are here, leave me a cup or a mug emoji to symbolize the Rachel incident. And if you've read this book, then you'll know why I'm asking for that emoji. That's it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well. If you want to connect with me elsewhere, all of my socials are linked down below in the description. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.